I remember the day everything changed as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings when the air feels sharp and fresh, and the leaves underfoot crunch with every step. The smell of damp earth and the distant scent of burning wood drifted through the air, stirring something deep inside me. Nostalgia, perhaps, or maybe just a yearning for simpler days. My family had always been complicated, like most families are, I suppose. We were tangled up in old wounds and misunderstandings, but we still managed to stay together, bound by blood and the grudging loyalty that comes with it. I grew up in a house where love often felt like an obligation rather than a gift. My parents, stern and distant, believed in hard work and practicality above all else. Emotions were rarely discussed, and when they were, it usually ended with someone storming out of the room. Despite all that, I had found my own ways to cope. Books became my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the tension that seemed to fill the air at home like an invisible fog. I devoured novels, losing myself in worlds where love conquered all, and family meant warmth and acceptance. It was my secret rebellion, my way of hoping for something better even when reality felt cold and unyielding. But the real turning point came when I moved away for college. For the first time, I tasted freedom. The absence of constant scrutiny felt intoxicating. I surrounded myself with new friends who seemed to accept me without question. They were vibrant, carefree, so different from the people I had grown up with. It was then that I realized just how much I had been holding back, trying to fit myself into a mold that was never meant for me. I spent years away from home, only visiting during the holidays, and even then, it was more out of obligation than desire. My parents hadn't changed. They remained rigid, their lives centered around routine and expectation. Each visit felt like a step backward, a return to the person I had worked so hard to leave behind. But something kept pulling me back. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was love, buried so deep under layers of resentment that I could barely recognize it. Whatever it was, it kept me coming home year after year, even when it felt like I was walking into a storm. The day I'm talking about, though, was different. I had received a phone call from my mother, her voice strained and brittle. She told me my father had fallen ill, something serious but vague, her words wrapped in denial. I booked a flight back home that very night, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios and unresolved grievances. Arriving home felt surreal. The house looked the same, but it seemed smaller somehow, as if years of neglect had caused it to shrink and sag under the weight of its own history. My mother greeted me with a tight hug, her arms trembling slightly. It struck me then how frail she looked, her once sharp features softened by age and worry. My father was bedridden, his condition worse than I had expected. Seeing him like that stirred something inside me. All those years of bitterness and frustration seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was forgiveness. Maybe it was simply the realization that time was running out. I spent days by his bedside, watching him drift in and out of sleep. My mother hovered nearby, her movements quick and anxious, as if she could fend off reality through sheer willpower. We didn't talk much, the silence between us heavy but oddly comforting. During those quiet hours, I found myself thinking about everything that had led me to this point. The choices I had made, the bridges I had burned, the people I had pushed away in my quest for independence. It was all there, laid out before me like a roadmap of regrets and missed opportunities. As the days passed, I began to see my parents differently. Their flaws, once so glaring, now seemed like symptoms of their own struggles. They had done their best with what they had, even if their best had often felt like not enough. I realized then that healing wouldn't come from waiting for them to change. It had to start with me, with letting go of the anger I had been carrying for so long. It was a slow process, one that required more patience than I thought I had. But it was worth it. Looking back now, I see that moment as the beginning of something new. A chance to rebuild what had been broken, not by trying to erase the past, but by learning to accept it. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something that resembled peace. After those first few days at home, the atmosphere began to shift. It was subtle at first, like the change in air before a storm. My mother and I moved around the house with a careful, practiced grace, avoiding the subjects that had once torn us apart. We focused on the practicalities of caring for my father. His medications, his meals, his moments of lucidity that came and went like brief flickers of light. But even in the silence, something was happening. The old anger I had carried with me for years had started to erode. It was as if watching my father's decline had forced me to confront not only his mortality but my own imperfections. I had spent so long blaming them for my unhappiness, convinced that their rigidity and lack of warmth had shaped me into someone I didn't want to be. Yet as I watched my mother tend to him with a tenderness that surprised me, I began to realize that I had only ever seen part of the picture. There was love in her actions, even if it was buried beneath layers of resentment and exhaustion. There was love in the way she adjusted his pillows, coaxed him to eat when his appetite was gone, and held his hand during the nights when the pain kept him awake. One afternoon, while she was out running errands, I sat beside him and studied his face. He looked so much older than I remembered. His skin was pale and paper-thin, his eyes dull with fatigue. It struck me then how little I truly knew him. He had always been a figure of authority, someone whose approval I had craved even as I resented his harshness. But there, in the quiet of that dimly lit room, I wondered what he had been like before life had worn him down, what dreams he had abandoned, what battles he had fought without ever speaking of them. I found myself reaching for his hand, feeling the roughness of his skin against mine. And in that moment, I felt something break open inside me. I started talking to him, my voice low and halting at first. I told him about my life, the things I had never shared because I had assumed he wouldn't care. The friends I had made, the jobs I had taken, the mistakes I had made along the way. He listened, or at least I liked to think he did. His eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow but steady. It became a habit, those one-sided conversations. I would sit with him for hours, letting words spill out like water from a broken dam. I talked about the childhood hurts that had festered into resentment, about my struggle to find a place where I felt I truly belonged. It was cathartic in a way I hadn't anticipated. Speaking aloud the thoughts I had kept locked away for so long made them feel less powerful, less capable of hurting me. And in the process, I started to understand my parents a little better. I began to see how their own unresolved pain had shaped them, how they had built walls around themselves to keep from being hurt. It was a flawed kind of love they had given me, but it was love nonetheless. As the weeks passed, my father's condition worsened. His moments of clarity grew shorter, his body thinner and weaker. My mother seemed to shrink along with him, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her grief. But she kept moving, her determination as fierce as ever. I started to help more, taking on tasks she had stubbornly insisted on doing herself. It was my way of trying to ease her burden, of making up for the years I had spent away. One evening, while washing dishes together, she surprised me by saying something that caught me off guard. She told me she was proud of me. The words sounded awkward and unfamiliar coming from her, but they struck a chord deep within me. It was the validation I had longed for but had never dared to expect. In that moment, I felt something shift between us. It was as if the distance that had kept us apart for so long was slowly beginning to dissolve. We still had our differences, but there was a sense of understanding growing between us, fragile but real. I began to wonder if healing was truly possible, not just for me, but for all of us. If forgiveness was something that could be built over time, like a house repaired brick by brick. The thought gave me hope, a delicate thread I clung to as the days stretched on. Looking back now, I can see that those weeks were a turning point, a time when I began to let go of the bitterness that had poisoned my thoughts for so long. It wasn't a perfect process. There were setbacks, moments of frustration and doubt. But the change had begun, and I was determined to see it through. I didn't realize it then, but the hardest part was still to come. The day everything truly broke apart was one I had dreaded and yet somehow expected. It had been weeks since I returned home, the days bleeding into each other in a haze of caregiving and reluctant reconciliation. My father's decline had become undeniable. The doctors were compassionate but blunt, their words carrying the weight of inevitability. My mother clung to hope with a desperation that bordered on denial. She insisted on pursuing every treatment, every possible remedy, as if sheer willpower alone could reverse the damage that illness had wrought. I watched her wear herself down, her stubbornness fraying at the edges as exhaustion took its toll. I tried to help her, but she often rejected my efforts, insisting that she could manage on her own. It became a pattern between us, a silent struggle over control that neither of us acknowledged outright. I understood her fear, her unwillingness to let go of the illusion that everything could still be fixed. But it pained me to watch her fight so hard against the inevitable. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, I found myself sitting outside on the porch. The air was cool and sharp, the stars glittering overhead like distant fires. I hadn't intended to be out there for long, but the quiet was soothing. It felt like a reprieve from the weight of the house, with all its memories and unspoken words. I heard the door creak open behind me and my mother stepped out, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She sat down beside me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if warding off a chill that went deeper than the air. For a while we sat there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Eventually she started talking, not about my father or the endless tasks that filled her days, but about herself. She spoke of the things she had sacrificed over the years, the dreams she had buried in order to be the wife and mother she thought she was supposed to be. Her voice was strained, her words hesitant, but there was a raw honesty to them that startled me. I realized then that I had never truly understood her. I had seen her only through the lens of my own pain, my own disappointments. But she was more than the stern, distant figure I had painted her to be. She was a woman who had made choices, some of them difficult, some of them flawed. And she was struggling just as much as I was. Hearing her speak that night changed something in me. It was as if a door had been opened, allowing me to see her not just as my mother, but as a person in her own right. Someone with her own fears and regrets. It made me wonder how many times I had failed to see the humanity in the people closest to me, blinded by my own resentment. The next morning, I approached her with a gentleness I hadn't known I was capable of. I offered to take on more responsibilities, to help her with the endless tasks that seemed to multiply each day. She hesitated, her eyes wary, but eventually she agreed. It felt like a truce of sorts, a tentative step toward something resembling cooperation. Over the following weeks, we fell into a routine. It was exhausting work, but there was a rhythm to it that felt almost comforting. We spoke more often, our conversations no longer laced with the same tension that had once defined our relationship. It wasn't perfect. We still had our disagreements, our moments of frustration, but there was a sense of mutual effort that hadn't been there before. It was during one of those quiet mornings, as I helped her prepare my father's breakfast, that she admitted something that took me by surprise. She told me she was afraid, not just of losing him, but of what her life would look like once he was gone. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her hands shaking slightly as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. For the first time, I saw her vulnerability laid bare. It was both humbling and painful to witness. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But I knew better than to offer false reassurances. Instead, I simply told her I was there, that I would stay for as long as she needed me. In that moment, something shifted between us. It was as if the walls we had built around ourselves were slowly crumbling, piece by piece. We were learning to lean on each other, to share the weight of the grief that had been pressing down on us for so long. I wish I could say that everything improved from that point on, but life rarely works that way. The progress we made was fragile, easily undone by a careless word or a moment of frustration. But it was progress nonetheless. And for the first time in years, I felt like we were moving toward something better. Looking back now, I see that time as a turning point. A moment when I began to understand that healing wasn't a single act of forgiveness or reconciliation. It was a process, slow and uneven, marked by moments of clarity and setbacks. And despite everything, I was willing to keep trying. As the weeks stretched into months, my father's condition continued to decline. The days felt longer, weighed down by the routine of care and the silent desperation that filled the house. It was a strange existence, one where time itself seemed to blur, as if each day was simply a repetition of the last. My mother and I had settled into a kind of uneasy partnership. We worked together out of necessity, our individual griefs entwined like roots growing through the same cracked soil. There were moments of tension, flashes of anger that flared up over small things. But those moments seemed less important now, eclipsed by the enormity of what we were facing. My father was rarely awake for long. When he was, his gaze often drifted past us, his thoughts lost in some place we couldn't reach. It was painful to watch him fade like that, his once formidable presence reduced to a fragile shell. But in those rare moments of clarity, he would sometimes look at me with a softness I had never known from him. One afternoon, as I sat beside him, he opened his eyes and fixed them on me with a clarity that startled me. His voice was faint, but there was a steadiness to it that made me lean in closer. He spoke of regrets, of mistakes he had made as a father. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged the distance that had grown between us. I listened, my chest tight with emotion. There was so much I wanted to say, but the words felt heavy and awkward in my throat. Instead, I simply held his hand and let him speak. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. There were no sweeping declarations of forgiveness or promises to do better. It was just two people, sitting together in the quiet, sharing something that felt like understanding. After that day, something shifted within me. It wasn't as if all the pain and resentment had simply disappeared, but I felt lighter, as if a burden I had been carrying for years had finally begun to lift. I found myself seeking out my mother's company more often, helping her with the tasks that had once seemed so overwhelming. We spoke more freely now, our conversations punctuated by awkward laughter and moments of genuine connection. It was strange, finding comfort in someone I had once viewed as an adversary. But there was a relief in it, too. A sense of belonging that I had never expected to find within the walls of that house. Still, the fear lingered, the knowledge that our fragile peace could be shattered at any moment. My father's health continued to deteriorate, his body growing weaker by the day. It was a slow, agonizing process, one that left all of us feeling helpless. I often found myself sitting by his bedside at night, listening to the shallow rhythm of his breathing. The darkness felt different then, less oppressive and more like a blanket pulled over the world. It was during those quiet hours that I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my emotions. The sadness, the anger, the guilt. It all came crashing down on me, wave after wave, until I felt hollowed out and exhausted. But there was also something else. A sense of acceptance that had begun to grow within me, like a seed planted in barren soil. I was starting to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the pain or pretending it had never existed. It was about learning to live with it, to carry it with grace instead of letting it consume me. My mother and I continued our dance of cooperation and conflict, our relationship slowly evolving into something neither of us had expected. We were both learning to let go of the past, to release the bitterness that had kept us at odds for so long. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old wounds would flare up, raw and bleeding. But there were also days when we found ourselves laughing together over something small and absurd. Those moments felt precious, like rare flowers blooming in a landscape scarred by fire. The day my father passed away was quiet, almost peaceful. I was sitting beside him, my hand resting on his, when his breathing slowed and then stopped altogether. There was no drama, no final words of wisdom or reconciliation, just a stillness that settled over the room like a blanket of snow. My mother and I sat together in silence, our grief a shared thing, heavy and raw. But even in the midst of that sorrow, there was a sense of release. The long struggle was over, and with it came a strange, bittersweet relief. Looking back, I can see that moment as a turning point, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It was the day I began to truly understand that healing was not a destination but a journey, one that I was finally ready to undertake. But I had no idea then how much further I still had to go. The weeks that followed my father's passing were a blur of arrangements, condolences, and empty gestures of sympathy. People who hadn't spoken to us in years suddenly appeared with casseroles and cards, their eyes brimming with pity. It was a kindness, I suppose, but it all felt hollow to me, as if grief was something that could be softened by platitudes and casseroles. My mother threw herself into the practicalities of loss. She became almost mechanical, her days filled with paperwork, phone calls, and the endless sorting of my father's belongings. She moved with a kind of frantic energy that left little room for anything else. I understood her need to keep busy, to drown out the pain with activity. But it worried me to see her so consumed. For my part, I felt adrift. My own grief was a tangled thing, full of contradictions and unresolved emotions. There was sadness, of course, but also guilt and anger and a strange, aching relief. I had spent so much of my life fighting against my parents, pushing them away in my quest for independence. And now that one of them was gone, I didn't know what to do with all the unresolved feelings left behind. I tried to talk to my mother about it once, late at night when the house felt too quiet, but she brushed me off, her gaze distant and unfocused. She insisted she was fine, that she didn't need to dwell on things that couldn't be changed. It was the same stubbornness I had always known from her, but now it felt like a wall I couldn't break through. In the absence of her attention, I found myself retreating into my own thoughts. I spent hours wandering through the house, my fingers tracing the worn edges of furniture, the faded photographs that lined the walls. Every object seemed to carry the weight of memory, a reminder of the years I had spent trying to distance myself from the place I had once called home. I thought about leaving, returning to the life I had built for myself far away from the tangled mess of family. But something kept me there, tethered to the house and to my mother's quiet desperation. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was something deeper, a need to make peace with the past before I could truly move forward. I began helping my mother with the sorting, sifting through old belongings that had accumulated over the years. Some things were easy to part with: old clothes, broken tools, stacks of yellowed newspapers. But other objects held a significance that was harder to define. Letters written in faded ink, childhood drawings preserved between the pages of books, souvenirs from trips we had taken when I was still young enough to believe that family meant safety and warmth. It was during one of those afternoons of sorting that I stumbled upon something unexpected. A small wooden box, tucked away in the back of a closet I had rarely ventured into. Its surface was scratched and worn, but the latch opened easily when I lifted it. Inside, I found a collection of letters, dozens of them, written in my father's careful, slanted handwriting. They were addressed to me, each one dated and folded neatly. My hands trembled as I lifted the first letter from the box, my heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and dread. I sat down on the floor, the box balanced on my knees, and began to read. The letters were a revelation. My father had written to me over the years, pouring out thoughts and emotions he had never been able to express in person. Some of the letters were angry, others apologetic. Many of them were filled with regrets, with attempts to explain his actions and his failures. Reading those letters felt like peeling away the layers of my own resentment, exposing the raw truth beneath. My father had been a flawed man, struggling with his own demons. He had tried, in his own clumsy way, to reach out to me even when I had been too hurt and angry to see it. I spent hours sitting there, lost in the words he had left behind. It was as if I was having a conversation with him across time, one that I had never known I needed. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but it was mingled now with something else: understanding, compassion, maybe even forgiveness. When I finally emerged from that room, my eyes swollen from tears I hadn't realized I'd been shedding, I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table. She looked up at me, her expression weary but curious. I told her about the letters, my voice thick with emotion. For a moment, she simply stared at me, her gaze unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. She admitted that she had known about the letters, that my father had started writing them after one of our worst arguments. He had kept them hidden, afraid to show them to me but unable to let them go. We talked for hours that night, our words spilling out in a way they never had before. It was painful, messy, but it was real. And for the first time, I felt like we were truly beginning to understand each other. Looking back, I realized those letters were a gift. A final attempt at connection from a man who had never known how to bridge the gap between us. And they were the first real step toward healing I had taken since his death. After discovering the letters, something shifted within me. It was as if the words my father had left behind had unlocked a door I had long kept sealed. The bitterness I had carried for years began to soften, replaced by a cautious sense of understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something close. A willingness to let go of the anger that had defined so much of my relationship with him. My mother and I continued to sort through the remnants of his life. The process was painstaking and often painful, but it also brought with it moments of clarity. As we sifted through old photographs and keepsakes, I began to piece together a version of my father that I had never fully known. A man who had been proud and stubborn, but also capable of kindness and vulnerability. One afternoon, as we packed away boxes in the attic, my mother finally allowed herself to speak about him. It started with small anecdotes, stories about their early years together, long before I was born. She spoke of their struggles, their dreams, the compromises they had made along the way. Her voice was steady, but there was a wistfulness to it that I had never heard before. I listened, my own memories stirring in response. For so long, I had seen my parents only through the narrow lens of my own pain. But hearing my mother's stories, I began to understand that their lives had been shaped by forces beyond my understanding. They had made mistakes, certainly, but they had also done their best with what they had. The more my mother spoke, the more I realized how much of her own grief had been hidden beneath the surface. She had built walls around herself, walls made of practicality and determination. But now, those walls were starting to crack, revealing the depth of her sorrow and regret. We spent hours talking that day, our conversation ranging from the mundane to the deeply personal. She admitted to feeling lost, unsure of who she was without my father by her side. The admission startled me, but it also made sense. They had been together for so long that their identities had become intertwined. His absence was a wound she didn't know how to heal. I told her about my own struggles, my fear that I would never be able to make peace with the past. She listened, her gaze steady and unflinching. For once, there was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet empathy that felt almost foreign. In the weeks that followed, our conversations continued. They weren't always easy. Old hurts had a way of resurfacing, sharp and unforgiving. But we kept talking, kept trying. It was the only way I knew how to move forward. I also continued to read my father's letters. They became a kind of solace, a bridge between the person I had known and the person he had wanted me to understand. His words were often clumsy and full of contradictions, but there was a sincerity to them that cut through my defenses. One letter in particular stayed with me. It was written during a time when I had been away at college, our relationship strained by distance and unspoken resentments. In the letter, he acknowledged his own failings, his inability to express himself in ways that mattered. He admitted to being afraid of losing me, of never being able to make things right. Reading those words was like being struck by lightning. I had spent so many years believing that he was incapable of change, that his coldness was a deliberate choice. But the letter revealed a different truth. He had been trying, in his own flawed way, to reach out to me, and I had been too consumed by my own anger to see it. The revelation was both painful and liberating. It forced me to confront my own shortcomings, my own unwillingness to forgive. But it also gave me permission to let go of the bitterness that had been weighing me down for so long. My mother and I continued to work through the house, our efforts punctuated by moments of shared grief and unexpected laughter. It was a slow process, but it felt like progress. The house itself seemed to change, the rooms growing brighter as we cleared away the clutter and allowed light to filter through. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was fragile, like a new leaf unfurling after a long winter. But it was real. Looking back now, I see that time as a turning point. A chance to rebuild not only my relationship with my mother, but also my relationship with myself. I was learning to accept the imperfections of my family, to see them as part of the same flawed, beautiful tapestry that made up my own existence. It wasn't a perfect process. There were days when I still felt the old resentment tugging at me, whispering that forgiveness was a betrayal of my own pain. But those days were becoming less frequent, and I was learning, slowly but surely, to let them go. I didn't know it then, but the hardest parts of the journey were still ahead. But for the first time, I felt ready to face them. The turning point in my journey came one chilly morning, months after my father's passing. My mother and I had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. We shared meals, discussed plans for the house, and even managed to find moments of genuine laughter. But beneath the surface, there was still a sense of unfinished business, a shadow that lingered over us, refusing to be ignored. It was during one of our rare conversations about the future that my mother brought up the idea of selling the house. The suggestion startled me. The house had been our anchor for so long, a place woven with memories both good and bad. But it was also a place burdened by the weight of grief and unresolved conflict. I asked her if she was certain. Her response was hesitant, her voice brittle. She admitted that the house no longer felt like home. It had become a museum of loss, a place where she could never truly move forward. Her words resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. I realized then that I had been clinging to the past just as much as she had, unable to imagine a future that didn't revolve around the same old patterns. The decision to sell the house was not made lightly. It took weeks of discussion, of weighing the pros and cons, of wrestling with the guilt that came with letting go of something so deeply entwined with our identities. But in the end, we both agreed it was the right thing to do. Preparing the house for sale was a daunting task. There were still rooms filled with my father's belongings, drawers crammed with papers and mementos that we had avoided dealing with. But this time, the process felt different. Less like an obligation and more like an opportunity to finally put the past to rest. We spent hours sorting through everything, deciding what to keep and what to part with. Some items were easy to let go of, their significance long since faded. Others were harder. Photographs, letters, objects that carried the weight of memory. But each decision felt like a step forward, a way of reclaiming our lives from the ghosts that had haunted us for so long. There were moments of frustration, of course, times when the sheer magnitude of the task felt overwhelming. But there were also moments of connection, moments when my mother and I would stumble upon something that made us laugh or cry or simply sit in silence, sharing the same unspoken thoughts. One afternoon, as we cleared out the attic, my mother came across an old journal she had kept during her early years of marriage. She handed it to me without explanation, her eyes shadowed by something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity overcame my hesitation, and I began to read. The journal was a revelation. It detailed her hopes and fears, her struggles to find her own identity within the confines of marriage and motherhood. She wrote about the pressure to be perfect, to meet expectations that always seemed just out of reach. But she also wrote about love, about the quiet moments of joy and connection that had kept her going even when everything else felt impossible. Reading her words felt like peering into a part of her life I had never known. It was both humbling and heartbreaking. I had spent so much time resenting her for what I perceived as coldness and rigidity. But her journal revealed a woman who had been fighting her own battles, who had made sacrifices I had never fully appreciated. When I finally looked up from the journal, my mother was watching me, her expression unreadable. She asked me what I thought, her voice steady but laced with something fragile. I told her the truth, that I understood her more now than I ever had before, that I was sorry for the years I had spent judging her without trying to see her side of things. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to shed. It was a moment of reckoning, one that left us both feeling raw and exposed. But it was also a moment of healing, a small but significant step toward rebuilding something we had both believed was broken beyond repair. The decision to sell the house became easier after that. We no longer saw it as a betrayal of the past, but as a way of making peace with it, of acknowledging everything that had come before while also allowing ourselves to move forward. The day we finally put the house on the market was bittersweet. We stood outside together, gazing up at the weathered facade that had once been our entire world. There was sadness, of course, but there was also a sense of relief, a sense of possibility. Looking back now, I see that moment as a turning point. Not just for my relationship with my mother, but for myself as well. I had spent so much of my life trying to escape the shadows of my past. But now, for the first time, I felt like I was finally stepping into the light. I had no idea what the future would hold. But for the first time, I felt ready to find out. Leaving the house felt like shedding an old skin. My mother and I watched from the curb as the movers loaded boxes into trucks, our belongings reduced to stacks of cardboard and carefully labeled crates. The house stood behind us, its windows dark and empty, as if it was already preparing to forget us. The sale went through quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. I had expected to feel something more profound when we handed over the keys. Sadness, relief, closure. But all I felt was numbness, a dull ache somewhere deep inside me that refused to be named. My mother moved into a small apartment not far from where the old house had been. It was modest but cozy, the kind of place that felt temporary despite her assurances that it was meant to be her new home. I visited often, helping her unpack, arranging furniture, hanging pictures on walls that still smelled of fresh paint. Our relationship had changed. It was still fragile, but there was a gentleness between us that had never been there before. We spoke more freely now, our conversations unencumbered by the weight of old grudges. I had come to accept that my mother was her own person, with her own pain and struggles that had nothing to do with me. But even as we rebuilt our connection, I found myself feeling restless. The freedom I had once craved now felt strangely hollow. It was as if I had spent so long running from my past that I no longer knew how to stand still. I threw myself into work, into friendships that felt increasingly shallow. The people I had once surrounded myself with now seemed distant, their lives full of pursuits I could no longer relate to. I found myself longing for something I couldn't name, a sense of belonging that eluded me at every turn. During one of my visits to my mother's apartment, she handed me a small box I didn't recognize. She told me she had found it while sorting through some of my father's things, tucked away in a drawer that had gone untouched for years. I opened it to find a collection of photographs, letters, and small trinkets, fragments of my childhood that I had long forgotten. Among the photographs was one of my father holding me as a baby, his face uncharacteristically soft and unguarded. I stared at the image for a long time, my mind struggling to reconcile the man I remembered with the man captured in that moment. The letters were addressed to me, much like the ones I had found before. But these were different. They were written during the earliest years of my life, long before our relationship had soured. They spoke of hope, of dreams for the future, of love that felt untainted by the bitterness that would come later. Reading them was like glimpsing a version of my father that had been lost to time. A man who had wanted to be better, who had struggled with his own flaws and limitations but had tried nonetheless. It made me realize how much I had allowed my anger to overshadow everything else. I shared the letters with my mother, her expression a mixture of sadness and something else I couldn't quite identify. She admitted that she had known about the letters but had chosen not to show them to me, believing they would only cause more pain. Her admission stung, but I understood her reasoning. We had all been trying to protect ourselves in our own flawed ways. In the weeks that followed, I began to reflect on everything that had happened. The house, the letters, the slow unraveling of years of resentment. It was as if I had been standing on the edge of something for so long, afraid to take the final step forward. I started spending more time with my mother, not out of obligation but out of genuine desire. We cooked meals together, went for walks, shared stories about my father that had once felt too painful to revisit. It was a quiet kind of healing, one built on shared moments rather than dramatic revelations. But even as our relationship grew stronger, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I had spent so much energy trying to mend the past that I had neglected to think about what came next. What kind of life I wanted to build for myself now that the old wounds were finally beginning to heal. I began to feel the pull of change, a sense that I needed to move beyond the confines of the life I had known. It wasn't about running away this time. It was about finding a way to move forward. One afternoon, as my mother and I sat on her small balcony overlooking the street below, I told her about my restlessness. about my desire to leave to explore something new. Her response surprised me. Instead of discouraging me, she encouraged me to follow that impulse. She said she understood that she had spent too many years holding herself back out of fear. Her words gave me the courage I needed. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by the past. A future where I could build something meaningful, something that felt like mine. Looking back now, I see that moment as the beginning of a new chapter. The moment I finally allowed myself to let go of the guilt and the pain, to embrace the possibility of something more. It was a daunting prospect, but it was also exhilarating. I didn't know where the journey would lead me, but for the first time I felt ready to find out. Leaving my mother behind was harder than I expected. Even though she had given me her blessing, the idea of moving away filled me with a strange mix of excitement and guilt. But I knew I needed to do it. Staying in the same place, trapped by the same patterns, would only keep me anchored to the past. I spent weeks preparing for the move, packing up my own belongings, making plans, saying goodbye to the people who had been part of my life for so long. It felt like closing a book I had spent years trying to rewrite, only to realize that the only way to move forward was to start a new one altogether. My mother and I kept in touch, of course. Phone calls and text messages, the occasional video chat where her smile looked just a little too forced. I knew she was trying to be strong, trying to give me the freedom she believed I needed. But I could hear the loneliness in her voice, the way her words sometimes faltered, as if she was trying to find the right things to say. I had moved to a new city, one bustling with energy and possibility. It was everything I had been craving, a chance to reinvent myself, to build a life free from the shadows of the past. I found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, its walls bare and impersonal, but full of potential. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of freedom I had only dreamed of. I threw myself into work, made new friends, explored the city with a curiosity that bordered on obsession. It was exhilarating, this sense of reinvention, but it was also terrifying, because no matter how far I tried to run, there were parts of me that refused to be left behind. I found myself thinking about my father more often than I expected. The letters he had written, the unfinished conversations we had never managed to have. It was strange, feeling his absence so acutely even as I tried to forge a life of my own. My mother's voice became a lifeline. We spoke almost every day, our conversations growing longer and more comfortable with time. She would tell me about her own attempts at building a new life, her tentative steps toward making friends, finding hobbies, rediscovering herself in the quiet aftermath of loss. But there were days when the silence between us felt heavy. Days when I could hear the loneliness in her words, when I felt the pull of home even as I tried to build something new. It was as if I was caught between two worlds, torn between the desire to move forward and the fear of leaving something important behind. One afternoon, months after my move, my mother called me sounding more animated than I had heard her in years. She told me about a class she had started attending, something about creative writing. It had been a whim, she admitted, but she had found herself enjoying it more than she expected. Her enthusiasm was contagious. I encouraged her to keep going, to explore whatever made her happy. And in the process, I found myself inspired by her courage. She was rebuilding her life, brick by brick, despite all the pain and loss she had endured. It made me realize that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a process of trial and error, of taking risks and allowing oneself to stumble along the way. And it was okay to struggle. It was okay to feel lost sometimes. Over the months that followed, I began to settle into my new life. I made friends who felt more like family than I had ever experienced before. I pursued interests I had once ignored, allowing myself the freedom to be curious and unguarded. But even as I found joy in the newness of it all, I couldn't help but feel the pull of the past. My mother and I continued to grow closer, our conversations filled with laughter and shared memories. But there was always an undercurrent of something deeper, a longing for connection that went beyond words. During one of our calls, my mother mentioned that she had been writing about my father. Not just his death, but his life. The man he had been before illness and bitterness had clouded everything. She spoke of him with a tenderness I had never heard before, her voice soft and steady. It struck me then how much we had both changed, how much we had learned from the pain we had endured. I found myself wanting to share my own thoughts, to speak openly about the things I had once kept locked away. I told her about my struggles, my fears, my doubts, about how I had been trying so hard to leave everything behind that I had nearly lost sight of what truly mattered. It was a conversation I had been avoiding for so long, but once I started, I couldn't stop. My mother listened, her silence patient and comforting. When I finished, she told me something I hadn't expected. She said she was proud of me, not for moving away or for building a new life, but for being willing to confront the parts of myself I had spent so long trying to ignore. Her words stayed with me long after our call ended. They felt like a gift, a reassurance that I was on the right path even when it felt uncertain. Looking back now, I see that moment as another turning point, a reminder that healing wasn't something that happened all at once. It was a journey made up of countless small steps, each one leading me closer to the person I wanted to become. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally learning how to move forward without leaving everything behind. The final steps of my journey were not marked by any grand revelations or dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, they were defined by a quiet persistence, a commitment to growth that was both subtle and profound. As the months turned into years, I continued to build a life that felt more like my own. I found work that challenged me in ways I had never expected, friendships that deepened into something genuine and lasting. The city I had once found so daunting began to feel like home, its streets and sounds weaving themselves into the fabric of my days. My relationship with my mother continued to evolve. We visited each other often, our conversations now filled with warmth and humor rather than tension and regret. She had found her own sense of purpose, her writing blossoming into something beautiful and deeply personal. She even published a collection of essays, pieces drawn from her own experiences of love and loss. Seeing her thrive brought me a joy I hadn't realized I had been craving. It was as if we had both emerged from the shadows of our past, our lives no longer defined by the pain we had once carried. Instead, we had learned to weave that pain into something new, something that allowed us to grow rather than wither. There were moments, of course, when the old wounds would reopen. Grief, I discovered, was not something that ever truly went away. It simply changed, its sharp edges softening over time. I would still find myself missing my father, the questions I would never get to ask him, the conversations left unfinished. But those moments no longer felt like anchors pulling me down. They were simply part of who I was, threads woven into the tapestry of my life. During one of my visits to my mother's apartment, I found her sorting through a new stack of letters. They were not from my father this time, but from people who had read her writing. Letters of gratitude, of shared experiences, of encouragement. I watched her eyes light up as she read them, her fingers tracing the words as if they were something precious. It struck me then how much she had changed, how much we both had. The woman who had once been so rigid, so closed off, now radiated a quiet strength that I found myself admiring. And I realized that my own growth had been shaped, in part, by hers. We spoke late into the night, our conversation drifting from the past to the future with an ease that had once seemed impossible. She asked me about my own writing, a hobby I had dabbled in but never fully embraced. Her encouragement was gentle but firm, a reminder that creativity was not something to be feared but embraced. Over the following months, I began to write in earnest. It was a process that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. But I kept going, my words fueled by the experiences I had spent so long trying to understand. Eventually, I found myself writing about my father, about the letters he had left behind, the lessons I had learned from him even after he was gone. It was a way of honoring his memory, of acknowledging the complexities of our relationship without letting them define me. My mother was my first reader, her feedback both thoughtful and encouraging. It became something of a ritual for us, sharing our work, celebrating each other's progress. It was a bond one had never expected to form, but one I treasured deeply. Looking back now, I see that my journey was never really about leaving the past behind. It was about learning to carry it with me in a way that allowed me to keep moving forward, to embrace both the beauty and the pain, the love and the loss, without allowing any one part to consume me. I have learned that healing is not a destination. It is a continuous process, a choice made over and over again. And it is one I am willing to keep making. My mother and I have come a long way from the people we once were. We have made mistakes, hurt each other in ways that still leave scars. But we have also learned to forgive, to accept, to grow. And in that growth, we have found something that feels a lot like peace. As I write these words, I realize that I am no longer trying to run from the past. Instead, I am learning to build something new from its remnants, something strong and beautiful and entirely my own. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time, I feel ready to embrace it, whatever it may bring. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts. It will help the channel grow and inspire me to create more interesting stories for you. I also want to apologize for any mistakes in the text, as the narration is done using artificial intelligence. If you notice any inaccuracies or areas that need improvement, please mention them in the comments. This will help make the content even better. Thank you for watching and for your support.